September 12th, 1958. Harlem was quiet, but the calm carried a weight that pressed against the brick walls of Lenox Avenue. Streetlights flickered over brownstones, casting long shadows where deals were made in whispers and loyalties were bought and sold for a handful of bills and a reputation. In the heart of it all, a man walked with a presence that demanded attention, even from those who would rather ignore him. His name was Bumpy Johnson. Not just a gangster, not just a name whispered with fear or respect. He was the anchor of a neighborhood, the unseen hand that balanced chaos with order. Tonight, the Italian mafia had put a price on more than just a life. They aimed to disrupt a network, a force that had grown too influential, too clever, too untouchable. And yet, Bumpy remained calm, moving through Harlem as if the city itself bent to his rhythm. His men watched silently, his friends trusted instinctively, and his enemies learned quickly that underestimating him was a fatal mistake. In this video, we're going to uncover 5 real stories that changed the streets under Bumpy's control. Each story carries a lesson in strategy, loyalty, and the ruthless logic of survival. From bodyguards pulled to the trigger at point-blank range, to betrayals that rattled entire criminal empires, these events didn't just make history, they reshaped the power of Harlem. As the night deepened, whispers of tension floated through the avenues. Every corner held a secret, every glance might be the last. The stories we will explore are not embellished fictions. They are reconstructed from real events, documented moments where decisions had consequences measured in blood, trust, and respect. So lean in. The streets of Harlem are alive with danger, strategy, and the quiet, unyielding power of a man who understood the rules of his world better than anyone. These 5 stories are a testament to Bumpy Johnson's genius, and the night he walked, the city listened. It's February 1940, and the winter air in Harlem bites harder than most realize. The avenues are slick with ice, the kind that catches the light of street lamps and turns every step into a calculated risk. But for those in Bumpy Johnson's circle, the danger wasn't the weather. It was the men who lurked in plain sight, waiting for the slightest misstep. At this time, Harlem had become a chessboard, each block a square, each building a potential battlefield. Bumpy, already known for his intellect and precision, moved through it like a king surveying his domain. He understood the balance of fear and respect, and in a world where betrayal was currency, trust was his most valuable asset. That winter evening, Bumpy's bodyguard, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned, was patrolling the block near 135th Street. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few late-night wanderers and the occasional cab that rattled past, its tires skimming over frozen puddles. Behind him, Bumpy walked with a quiet confidence, his overcoat buttoned tight against the chill. The 2 men were more than protector and boss. They were symbols of order in a neighborhood teetering on chaos. For Bumpy, every step mattered. Every glance, every sound could signal opportunity or threat. The Italian mafia had been encroaching on Harlem for months. They were methodical, patient, willing to pay the right people to weaken Bumpy's influence. Rumors circulated of a planned hit, a hit not just on Bumpy, but on anyone loyal enough to stand in the way. The bodyguard knew the stakes. Each footstep echoed in the silent night like a drumbeat counting down to an inevitable confrontation. Bumpy, calm and composed, sensed the tension without needing to look back. Harlem had trained him to read more than faces. He read the rhythm of the streets, the undercurrent of danger that flowed through alleyways, clubs, and corner stores. Suddenly, a car slowed near the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Men inside moved in a way that was deliberate, practiced, the kind of precision that only comes with experience in a life of crime. The bodyguard's hand brushed the weapon at his hip, his instincts sharpening. In an instant, Bumpy's world shifted. This was no ordinary threat. The mafia had sent someone to test their boundaries, to see if Bumpy could be cornered, if his loyalty could be fractured. The vehicle stopped. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a face that was all business and menace. Words were exchanged, but the bodyguard's eyes never left the motion. Tension thickened the air, pressing against the walls of Harlem as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. The next moment, decisions would be made in fractions of a second, actions that would echo through Harlem's alleys and clubs, through lives and legacies. Every man, every street, every shadow could become a weapon, and only the sharpest, most disciplined would survive the night. This was the world Bumpy Johnson navigated, a world where intelligence and instinct outweighed brute force, where respect was earned and betrayal punished swiftly, and where a single trigger could change the course of history. The bodyguard's hand tightened around the gun. Bumpy's eyes remained calm, unshaken, the calm before the storm, the precise moment where history was about to pivot. And in that frozen February night, Harlem waited, silent, tense, ready for what was about to unfold. The tension in Harlem that night was palpable. The car remained parked just beyond the flickering street lamp, its engine humming like a predator waiting to strike. Inside, men whispered urgently, calculating their move, unaware that Bumpy Johnson and his bodyguard were not just waiting, they were anticipating. In Harlem, every street had eyes, every corner had ears, and every subtle movement could unravel the carefully woven plans of those who underestimated the neighborhood's most notorious figure. Bumpy's reputation wasn't built on reckless bravado. It was the product of patience, observation, and a mind that treated each threat like a puzzle to be solved before it became a catastrophe. The bodyguard's gaze shifted between Bumpy and the approaching menace, the weight of the situation settling over him like the dense winter air. Every instinct screamed the same warning. One wrong move could cost lives. Bumpy, however, moved with an unshakable calm, his hands tucked into his overcoat, his eyes scanning, analyzing. He had encountered similar scenarios before, small-time provocations masked as serious threats, but this felt different. The men outside were trained, precise, and willing to go further than most. Harlem's streets had taught Bumpy to respect danger, but never to fear it. And tonight, that distinction would define the outcome. The car door opened slowly, releasing a chill that mingled with the winter wind. A man stepped out, a known enforcer for the Italian mafia, his movements deliberate, measured. The presence of this figure confirmed what Bumpy had suspected for weeks. The mafia was escalating, moving from whispers to action. Harlem had tolerated encroachment in small doses, but any attempt to directly threaten Bumpy's men or territory was a line that could not be crossed. The enforcer's eyes met the bodyguard's, a silent message passing between two men aware that the tension could erupt into violence at any second. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the icy pavement with measured confidence. It was the bodyguard, his weapon discreetly drawn but aimed with precision. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Every detail he had observed, the posture of the mafia enforcer, the positioning of the car, the potential escape routes, had been catalogued and committed to memory. And then, at the precise moment, when the enforcer made the mistake of underestimating the calm efficiency of Harlem's protectors, the trigger was pulled. The shot rang out, sharp and decisive, cutting through the night like a crack of lightning. Chaos followed instantly. The car's doors slammed, the engine roared, and Harlem's winter wind seemed to carry the echoes of that single, fatal shot down Lenox Avenue. But in the midst of panic, Bumpy remained composed, his presence a stabilizing force. The bodyguard, standing firm, understood that this action was not just about survival. It was about sending a message. Loyalty in Harlem was non-negotiable. Betrayal was punished swiftly. And anyone who sought to disrupt the order that Bumpy had meticulously cultivated would learn that lesson the hard way. In the aftermath, silence reclaimed the street. The mafia enforcer lay incapacitated, the car abandoned in a frozen haze, and Harlem's residents, though unaware of the specifics, felt the subtle shift of power. The city had witnessed, in a single moment, the demonstration of strategy over impulse, intelligence over brute force. Bumpy's eyes scanned the street, calm as ever, calculating the next move even as the immediate threat had been neutralized. That night, a simple trigger at point-blank range didn't just protect a man. It solidified a reputation, a warning, and a legacy that would echo through the streets for years to come. The aftermath of the gunshot was more than just a moment frozen in time. It was a test of strategy, resolve, and the intricate web of power that Bumpy Johnson had spent years weaving throughout Harlem. As the winter wind swept down Lenox Avenue, carrying the echo of the shot, the neighborhood seemed to exhale collectively. A tension lifted, but replaced with an even deeper understanding. The streets belonged to Bumpy and those loyal to him. Inside a nearby brownstone, Bumpy's mind was already several steps ahead, planning the next phase. Every action, every reaction, had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate confrontation. Harlem was not just a place. It was a chessboard, and every player, friend or foe, was a piece to be carefully maneuvered. Bumpy's bodyguard, still standing at the curb, felt the weight of what had just occurred. He had acted decisively, but under Bumpy's watchful eye, he knew the mission was not complete. The Mafia's enforcer was neutralized, yes, but the ripple effects of this action would need to be managed. Bumpy walked slowly toward him, each step deliberate, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded. "Good work," Bumpy said quietly, his voice low but steady, a tonal mixture of respect and authority. "But this isn't over. Never forget the streets watch, the families watch, and our enemies will look for any weakness. Keep your eyes open, always." The strategy was clear: containment before escalation. Bumpy knew that if word of the shooting spread too quickly without proper framing, it could provoke a larger response from the Italian mafia, potentially spiraling into a full-blown war across Harlem. So he acted methodically, reaching out to key allies, ensuring that loyalty was reinforced and any dissent preemptively addressed. His approach was not one of intimidation alone. It was intelligence, preparation, and control. The bodyguard had executed the act, but Bumpy was orchestrating the narrative. Harlem needed to see order, not chaos, even in the aftermath of lethal violence. Hours later, in the quiet of his office above a nightclub on 133rd Street, Bumpy reviewed the night's events, cross-referencing reports from informants, allies, and street-level operatives. Every detail mattered: the precise timing of the mafia enforcer's approach, the bodyguard's response, the reaction of the neighbors who witnessed fragments of the incident. Bumpy's mind worked like a clock, each gear representing a different variable in Harlem's intricate ecosystem. His reputation had been tested, and through a combination of calculated risk and decisive action, he had emerged unshaken. But he knew better than anyone. Survival in Harlem was never about a single victory. It was about the accumulation of intelligence, influence, and unwavering strategy. By dawn, Harlem itself seemed to breathe a new rhythm, quieter, but charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Stories would begin to circulate, but Bumpy had already ensured they carried the intended message. He protected his own, and anyone daring to threaten him or his neighborhood paid a steep price. The bodyguard, once a shadow moving behind him, was now a visible symbol of the deadly efficiency Bumpy commanded. That night became a case study in power projection, neutralizing a threat decisively, managing the narrative, and reinforcing loyalty. The city had witnessed a moment where intellect and precision outweighed brute force, and the lesson was unmistakable. Harlem had not just survived an attack, it had observed a masterclass in strategy. In the weeks that followed, the incident continued to shape alliances and perceptions. Rival factions hesitated, second-guessing their moves, and even those within Bumpy's circle recognized the delicate balance between trust and vigilance. The streets were alive with whispers of the event, each retelling emphasizing the calculated calm, that defined Bumpy Johnson. What could have been chaos instead became a reinforcement of his authority. That night, a single, decisive action at point-blank range had not only protected a man, but reinforced the intricate framework of loyalty, intelligence, and influence that made Harlem's underworld respect and fear its king. Weeks after that fateful February night, Harlem carried a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The avenue still hummed with their usual rhythm: cab horns, late-night chatter, and the occasional distant siren. But beneath it ran an undercurrent of acknowledgement. Bumpy Johnson had acted decisively and strategically, and the neighborhood knew it. The mafia enforcer who had approached that icy street corner had become more than a statistic. He was a cautionary tale whispered among men who considered challenging Bumpy's dominion. In a world built on intimidation and reputation, the Bodyguard's trigger had done more than neutralize a threat. It had sent a message that resonated through every shadowed alley and every smoky club in Harlem. Bumpy's office became a hub of calm authority. The men who reported to him knew that survival was about more than violence. It was about foresight, loyalty, and precise execution. Each individual knew that their actions reflected on the neighborhood itself, and Bumpy enforced this understanding with a quiet insistence that left no room for misjudgment. His bodyguard, once operating as a background presence, was now recognized as an extension of that authority. The lethal efficiency he had displayed was a statement of principle: protect the neighborhood, protect its leader, and act without hesitation when the line between survival and betrayal was crossed. The Italian mafia, notorious for their patience and methodical approach, realized that Harlem under Bumpy Johnson operated by different rules. They attempted to analyze the night's events, seeking patterns or weaknesses, but what they found was a calculated orchestration beyond mere reaction. Bumpy had anticipated not just the enforcer's presence, but the ripple effect it would create. By containing the incident, controlling its narrative, and reinforcing loyalty among his men, he had turned a potential crisis into a demonstration of authority. For rival factions, it became clear: Harlem could not be intimidated, and its protector would not be outmaneuvered. Neighborhood residents, unaware of the precise details, sensed the invisible hand that had kept the streets from erupting into retaliation. Bumpy's influence was not just through fear, it was through stability. Drug dealers, club owners, and everyday citizens understood that the order he maintained was deliberate, and that any disruption invited swift, calculated consequences. The streets respected him because he had created a system where loyalty, intelligence, and strategy mattered more than sheer aggression. Even those who had initially doubted his capacity to defend the neighborhood found themselves reconsidering. Harlem had witnessed, in one night, the embodiment of disciplined power. By the time spring edged into the city, the tale of the bodyguards shot at point-blank range became more than an isolated incident. It became a reference point for loyalty, strategy, and consequence. Bumpy Johnson had turned what could have been an act of panic into a lesson in control. Every corner, every alleyway, every whispered conversation in Harlem carried the unspoken acknowledgement that the neighborhood was protected, its hierarchy respected, and its king vigilant. The lesson was simple but profound. In Harlem, survival was reserved for those who understood the rules, those who acted decisively, and those who recognized the calculated mind behind the calm exterior. And in the heart of it all, Bumpy Johnson's presence remained unshaken, a reminder that in the quiet streets of Harlem, history was written not just by those who pulled the trigger, but by the man who orchestrated the conditions for that shot to define an era. It was the spring of 1941 when tensions in Harlem began to simmer again, this time on a scale that threatened the delicate balance Bumpy Johnson had meticulously maintained. The neighborhood, while still loyal to him, had grown increasingly attractive to external forces, particularly the Italian mafia, whose influence had been steadily encroaching from Brooklyn and lower Manhattan. Rumors had been circulating for months. The mafia sought control over the numbers game, Harlem's underground lottery that generated immense revenue and influence. For Bumpy, the numbers racket wasn't just about money. It was about authority, loyalty, and the unspoken social contracts that bound his community together. Every move he made needed to be precise, calculated, and devoid of unnecessary spectacle. One evening, reports came in from multiple sources. Key numbers operators had been approached, subtly threatened, and bribed, all in an attempt to weaken Bumpy's hold on Harlem. The mafia's agents were careful, sending men who appeared ordinary to the untrained eye, clerks, shopkeepers, even casual acquaintances, men whose loyalty could be bought with enough cash and intimidation. But Bumpy Johnson saw through these facades. Years of observing patterns, human behavior, and the rhythm of Harlem streets had honed his intuition to a fine edge. He understood that the true battle was never in open gunfire, but in the manipulation of influence, the silent tests of loyalty, and the strategic placement of allies. That night, Bumpy convened a discreet meeting with his closest associates. Inside a dimly lit backroom of a Harlem brownstone, the conversation was calm but loaded with urgency. Men sat around a worn wooden table, cigarette smoke curling in the shadows, their faces lit intermittently by the flicker of a single lamp. "They're testing us," Bumpy said quietly, his tone measured, almost conversational. "Not here for a fight, but for control. Every man who runs the numbers, every dealer, every connection they can sway, that's their target. And we will show them Harlem answers differently." There was no anger in his voice, no bravado, just a chilling clarity that left the men in the room understanding the stakes without needing further explanation. Over the next several nights, surveillance and intelligence became Bumpy's primary weapon. He and his trusted operatives mapped every interaction, tracked every unusual meeting, and identified potential traitors before they could act. It wasn't an act of paranoia. It was an act of strategy, a proactive approach to ensuring Harlem's independence. One by one, the mafia's attempts to influence the numbers operators were intercepted. Messages were delivered, warnings issued, and loyalty reinforced. Each intervention was calculated to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while silently dismantling the mafia's creeping influence. By the end of the week, the streets themselves had shifted under the invisible hand of Bumpy Johnson. Rumors of mafia intimidation persisted, but they carried no weight. Dealers and operators remained loyal, knowing that any attempt to subvert them would be met with consequences measured in precision and efficiency. Bumpy had not fired a single shot that week, yet the message was unmistakable. Harlem was his domain, and attempts to manipulate it were futile. The balance of power, always precarious, had been maintained through strategy, foresight, and an unwavering understanding of human behavior. In Harlem, the numbers game continued, not as a gamble, but as a testament to the quiet but absolute authority of its king. Tensions in Harlem reached a new level that spring as the Italian mafia, frustrated by Bumpy Johnson's deft maneuvering, began exploring more direct methods of exerting control. The neighborhood had grown restless in subtle ways. Whispers of fear among operators, glances over shoulders, and the occasional hurried footstep in darkened alleys. The mafia's goal was clear. They wanted to dominate the numbers game, to siphon profits, and ultimately to undermine the influence of the man who had become Harlem's unspoken protector. For Bumpy, the challenge was not merely financial. It was a test of authority, loyalty, and the structural integrity of the system he had painstakingly built. One evening, intelligence came from an unexpected source. A local bartender who had observed a series of meetings between known mafia affiliates and some of Harlem's more vulnerable numbers operators. They were plotting, testing the boundaries, attempting to pressure the operators into compliance without provoking outright confrontation. The bartender's report was precise, detailing times, locations, and individuals involved. Bumpy absorbed this information with measured calm. He understood the value of timing, of subtle intervention, and of psychological leverage. Harlem was a city of observation, and every glance, every whisper carried weight. Bumpy acted methodically. That night, he and his closest lieutenants began a series of targeted interventions. Operators were visited discreetly, reassured of their safety, and reminded of the consequences of disloyalty, not with threats of immediate violence, but with a strategic demonstration of control. "We don't fight every battle with bullets," Bumpy explained quietly, as his men gathered intelligence and coordinated movements. "Sometimes a shadow in the right place tells more than a gunshot ever could." His calm, authoritative tone left no room for doubt. Loyalty and vigilance were paramount, and any attempt to compromise Harlem's integrity would fail. Meanwhile, the Mafia continued their calculated approach, sending small teams to observe and intimidate. But Bumpy's intelligence network was faster, more adaptive. Each potential infiltration was anticipated and neutralized before it could gain traction. Operators remained loyal, partially out of fear, partially out of respect for the strategic genius of the man orchestrating their protection. Harlem's streets, usually unpredictable and chaotic, now moved according to an invisible order maintained by Bumpy Johnson. Every alleyway, every corner store, every nightclub became part of a broader system of observation and deterrence. By the end of the week, the Mafia's overt attempts to influence Harlem had been effectively neutralized. Bumpy had avoided direct confrontation while demonstrating that his control was absolute. Operators continued their work, confidence restored, and the neighborhood's rhythm returned to a measured, secure pace. For Bumpy, this was more than just a victory. It was a reinforcement of his philosophy. Influence and strategy outweigh brute force, and a city's loyalty is earned through foresight, precision, and unwavering authority. Harlem had been tested, the Mafia's intentions exposed, and the streets remained under the careful, watchful hand of a man who understood that survival, above all, was the product of intelligence and calculated action. The following weeks in Harlem were a study in patience, observation, and controlled influence. Bumpy Johnson knew that overt aggression from the Italian mafia would only provoke chaos that could spiral beyond his control. Instead, he relied on intelligence, subtlety, and the silent power of presence. Every interaction, every minor negotiation, was part of a broader strategy to maintain Harlem's autonomy. The numbers game, central to both income and influence in the neighborhood, had become a battlefield without visible scars. Its war waged in shadows, whispers, and calculated movements rather than open gunfire. For Bumpy, this was familiar territory. He thrived in this quiet tension, where every decision had ramifications that rippled through the streets, and every man's loyalty was both tested and reinforced. One evening, reports reached Bumpy that a high-ranking enforcer from the Mafia had been seen entering a Harlem tenement on 139th Street. This was no minor operative. This was a man sent to assert influence, to subtly intimidate numbers operators into submission. Bumpy's response was meticulous. He dispatched trusted lieutenants to monitor the building and the surrounding streets while he maintained a presence nearby, unobtrusive but commanding. Harlem itself became a chessboard, each building a square, every passerby a potential piece in the larger game of influence. Bumpy's mind moved faster than any street rumor. He anticipated the enforcer's movements, predicted potential encounters, and prepared contingencies without alerting the neighborhood to the heightened tension. Inside the tenement, the enforcer met with several local operators. His demeanor was calm, authoritative, and designed to intimidate without immediate confrontation. But Bumpy had already anticipated this. Information flowed from his network. Shopkeepers, porters, and even neighborhood children trained to watch for unusual behavior relayed details of the meeting with precision. By the time the enforcer realized he was being observed, Bumpy's men were in position, ready to intercede if necessary, their presence invisible yet palpable. It was a lesson in controlled power, the ability to influence outcomes without ever revealing the full extent of one's capabilities. Bumpy's approach that night exemplified his philosophy. He did not rely on the threat of immediate violence, nor did he seek to humiliate his adversary. Instead, he demonstrated that Harlem was a tightly controlled ecosystem, one in which loyalty was rewarded and interference meticulously tracked. The enforcer, recognizing the invisible hand at work, left the building without taking any aggressive action. The numbers operators, meanwhile, were reminded subtly of their allegiance and of the strategic mind that ensured their survival. Harlem continued to function, unshaken, as if the tension had been nothing more than a ripple in its normal rhythm. By the dawn of the next day, the streets of Harlem had returned to their measured pace, but the impact of the previous night lingered. The Italian mafia understood, through observation rather than confrontation, that Harlem under Bumpy Johnson operated on rules they could neither predict nor easily manipulate. Strategy, intelligence, and calm authority had neutralized a potentially dangerous incursion. Harlem had been tested again, and once more Bumpy emerged not through brute force, but through meticulous planning, psychological insight, and the quiet, undeniable projection of power. The message was clear. Any attempt to undermine Harlem's autonomy would be met with precision, foresight, and the unshakable resolve of its king. The tension in Harlem was far from over. The Italian mafia, frustrated by repeated failures to exert influence over the numbers game, escalated their approach, now targeting intermediaries, those who had direct access to Bumpy Johnson and his inner circle. Their strategy was calculated: destabilize the network from within, test the limits of loyalty, and exploit any weakness they could uncover. For Bumpy, this was more than a challenge. It was a test of the structure he had painstakingly built over years. The stakes were no longer just financial. They were about maintaining the integrity of Harlem itself, a neighborhood that had come to rely on his presence for order and protection. One night, word came from a trusted informant. A former associate of Bumpy's had been seen meeting with a small contingent of mafia operatives near 135th Street. The man had once been a loyal operator in the numbers game, but signs of wavering allegiance had begun to emerge. Bumpy absorbed the information in silence, weighing his options. Any move needed to be precise, both to protect the neighborhood and to prevent unnecessary escalation. He understood that a direct confrontation might provoke the mafia further, yet inaction would embolden them. Strategy, intelligence, and timing would determine the outcome. Over the following days, Bumpy deployed his network with surgical precision. Trusted lieutenants discreetly monitored the former associate, while neighborhood contacts relayed movements, conversations, and suspicious activity. Simultaneously, Bumpy reached out to his loyal operators, reaffirming the value of trust and the consequences of disloyalty, not through threats of public violence, but through measured interventions that reinforced his authority. Harlem was a city of observation, and each individual could see, if they paid attention, that the structure surrounding Bumpy Johnson was unyielding and omnipresent. Then came the critical night. The former associate, emboldened by his meeting with mafia operatives, attempted to orchestrate a subtle disruption of the numbers game. But Bumpy's preparations were flawless. The neighborhood's rhythm, monitored and guided by his network, allowed Bumpy to intercept the man's plan before it could gain traction. Confrontations were swift and contained. Words were exchanged privately, measured, and deliberate. Bumpy demonstrated that loyalty was not merely expected. It was observed, rewarded, and enforced through strategic intelligence rather than public spectacle. The former associate, now fully aware of the consequences of betrayal, was quietly but firmly reminded of his place within Harlem's hierarchy. By dawn, Harlem's streets were calm again, though the invisible battle had been anything but quiet. The Mafia's attempt to destabilize the numbers game had been neutralized without a single public gunfight. Bumpy had once again demonstrated the power of strategy, influence, and calculated control. His network had preempted threats, reinforced loyalty, and maintained order. Harlem, the lesson was clear. Disruption would not go unaddressed, manipulation would be exposed, and Bumpy Johnson's authority was absolute. The neighborhood thrived not just because of the man himself, but because of the meticulous systems of intelligence, loyalty, and foresight he had established. A reminder that in Harlem, survival and success belonged to those who understood the subtle, decisive exercise of power. By mid-1941, the Italian mafia's frustration had reached a boiling point. Their repeated attempts to coerce Harlem's numbers operators had failed, and their subtle manipulations were exposed and neutralized before they could take root. For Bumpy Johnson, this was an expected escalation, a test of both his strategic acumen and the loyalty of those who operated within his sphere of influence. Harlem had become a stage where every move was observed, every action measured, and every consequence anticipated. The neighborhood's survival depended not on brute force alone, but on a calculated orchestration of intelligence, presence, and influence, a discipline that Bumpy had mastered long before any outsider recognized his dominance. On a chilly evening in early June, Bumpy called a meeting with his closest allies and lieutenants in a discreet Harlem brownstone. The room was dimly lit, the faint smell of tobacco smoke and whiskey lingering in the air. The discussion was quiet but intense, each word deliberate. "They're desperate," Bumpy said, his tone calm but firm. "And desperation is dangerous. We can't meet them with the same methods they've tried before. We need leverage, precision, and the patience to see them falter on their own. Every move they make, we observe. Every weakness, we exploit. Harlem will not be compromised." His words carried authority, a quiet command that resonated with the men in the room. This was more than a strategy session. It was a lesson in controlled power, a demonstration of how a man could assert dominance without chaos overtaking his territory. That week, intelligence operations intensified. Trusted operatives monitored mafia movements, relayed conversations, and reported anomalies among Harlem's numbers operators. Every attempt at bribery, intimidation, or subtle sabotage was intercepted. Bumpy relied not on open confrontation, but on the silent, pervasive presence of his network. The operators, now fully aware of the stakes, reinforced their allegiance, understanding that loyalty was rewarded through protection and strategic support, while betrayal or weakness was neutralized before it could manifest. Harlem's rhythm continued undisturbed, but beneath the surface, the streets were alive with unseen forces orchestrated by Johnson's calculated hand. The culmination of this effort came on a sweltering June night when a high-ranking mafia representative arrived to negotiate directly with one of Bumpy's operators. Expecting intimidation or coercion, the representative instead encountered the calm authority of Harlem's unseen protector. Bumpy intervened subtly, leveraging both the loyalty of his men and the intelligence gathered over the previous weeks. The negotiation was controlled, precise, and ultimately favorable for Harlem. The mafia representative left with no gains, their ambitions thwarted, their influence contained. It was a victory achieved not through violence, but through the strategic application of presence, observation, and psychological leverage. By the following morning, Harlem's operators resumed their routines, confident in the knowledge that their network remained secure and their autonomy intact. The Italian mafia, once emboldened, had been forced to recognize the limits of their influence. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated once again that his power was derived not from reckless aggression, but from foresight, intelligence, and the disciplined orchestration of loyalty and observation. Harlem remained independent, its streets governed by rules that outsiders could neither predict nor manipulate. In the delicate dance of control, strategy, and authority, Bumpy had turned a potential crisis into a lasting affirmation of his dominance, reinforcing the principle that in Harlem, survival was reserved for those who understood the subtle art of power. By late 1942, Harlem had become a tense chessboard of influence, with every street corner and nightclub a potential point of conflict. Dutch Schultz, one of the era's most notorious and ruthless gangsters, had set his sights on the neighborhood. Schultz was a man known for volatility, unpredictability, and a willingness to use extreme violence to expand his empire. His interest in Harlem's lucrative numbers game posed a serious threat to Bumpy Johnson's carefully maintained balance of power. For Bumpy, this was not merely a contest of money. It was a direct challenge to his authority, his strategy, and the community that relied on his protection. Every decision now carried weight far beyond personal survival. The stakes included the stability of an entire neighborhood. In the early weeks of Schultz's maneuvers, Harlem's operators noticed subtle disruptions. Bookkeeping errors were reported, small-time enforcers pressured, and trusted contacts suddenly disappeared or acted suspiciously. Bumpy, ever observant, pieced together the signs with methodical precision. It was not the first time an external force had tried to infiltrate his territory, and his approach remained the same: anticipate, contain, and neutralize before chaos could spread. He relied on intelligence from street-level operatives, nightclub staff, and even unsuspecting civilians who provided unwitting surveillance. Every detail mattered, every movement, every conversation, and every hesitation could signal loyalty or betrayal. One night, a meeting was convened in a Harlem brownstone, dimly lit and shielded from prying eyes. Bumpy gathered his closest lieutenants, explaining the threat with clarity and calm authority. "Schultz doesn't understand Harlem," he said, voice low and deliberate. "He believes fear and force are enough. But our strength is in foresight, observation, and loyalty. We don't react, we anticipate. Every move he makes, we are ready. Every man who betrays us is already accounted for." There was no bravado in his words, only the chilling certainty of a man who had calculated the balance of power and knew precisely how to maintain it. The turning point came when Schultz sent a known enforcer into Harlem under the guise of negotiating alliances with local operators. Bumpy's surveillance network had already identified the man and mapped his likely movements. Rather than confronting him openly, Bumpy orchestrated a series of subtle interventions. Communications were intercepted, operators were discreetly reinforced, and the enforcer found himself isolated at every critical juncture. By the time he realized the depth of surveillance and loyalty within Harlem, his mission had been rendered impossible. Schultz's plan unraveled silently, leaving his enforcer with no leverage and Harlem's operations fully intact. Through these calculated maneuvers, Bumpy Johnson once again demonstrated the principles that defined his reign: strategy over violence, intelligence over chaos, and loyalty over fear. Dutch Schultz, despite his notoriety and resources, was forced to retreat from Harlem's streets, recognizing that the neighborhood was governed not by random force, but by the deliberate, invisible hand of a man who understood every facet of human behavior and urban power dynamics. Harlem remained secure, its operators loyal, and its streets a testament to the calculated, unwavering authority of Bumpy Johnson, a man whose intellect and foresight ensured that even the most dangerous adversaries could be contained without a single public gunfight. As Dutch Schultz's ambitions collided with Harlem's intricate web of loyalty and influence, Bumpy Johnson remained the calm center in a storm of potential chaos. By early 1943, Schultz had grown increasingly impatient. His attempts to dominate the numbers game were failing, and every effort to intimidate operators only reinforced the community's reliance on Bumpy. Harlem streets, while bustling with everyday life, were now also silent battlegrounds of observation, trust, and strategic maneuvering. Bumpy understood that in this war of influence, visibility was a liability, and subtlety was his most lethal weapon. He never rushed, never acted out of impulse. Every step was part of a calculated plan designed to protect the neighborhood and maintain control over its vital operations. One evening, reports arrived that Schultz had dispatched a more experienced enforcer into Harlem, a man known for ruthless efficiency and a willingness to bypass negotiation entirely. The enforcer's assignment was clear: intimidate, manipulate, and eliminate any obstacles to Schultz's expansion. For Bumpy, this was no ordinary threat. The man had a history of violent confrontations and had been involved in numerous high-profile hits across New York. But Bumpy, as always, relied on information and foresight rather than reactionary force. He deployed a network of trusted lieutenants, surveillance contacts, and street informants to monitor every movement. Every alley, every storefront, and every known operator became part of a living map, allowing Bumpy to anticipate the enforcers' moves before they could escalate into open violence. Over the following nights, Harlem became a chessboard of subtle interventions. The enforcer attempted to approach operators, only to encounter obstacles that seemed almost invisible but were meticulously orchestrated. Communications he thought private were intercepted, meetings he planned were disrupted without confrontation, and allies he expected to be compliant were quietly reinforced with loyalty. Bumpy's strategy was not to confront Schultz's man with immediate force, but to render his attempts ineffective through anticipation, observation, and strategic positioning. Every step taken by the enforcer was countered before it could gain traction, leaving him frustrated, exposed, and ultimately ineffective. At the same time, Bumpy reinforced the cohesion and loyalty of Harlem's operators. In private discussions, he emphasized trust, foresight, and awareness. Operators understood that deviation from loyalty was not merely a breach of principle, but a direct threat to the survival of their network. Bumpy's calm authority reminded them that Harlem's stability depended on discipline, intelligence, and collective vigilance. Even those who were tempted by the mafia's bribes or intimidation realized that any attempt to undermine Bumpy's system would be observed, anticipated, and countered without mercy or error. Harlem itself became a fortress, not of bricks and mortar, but of calculated presence and unwavering influence. By the end of this campaign, Schultz's enforcer returned empty-handed, reporting not just failure, but the futility of challenging Harlem's internal cohesion. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that dominance was maintained not through public displays of force, but through the precise orchestration of loyalty, intelligence, and strategy. Harlem remained intact, its streets safe under his watch, and the operators loyal to a system that valued foresight over brute strength. Even the most ruthless outside force learned that in Harlem, authority was invisible, calculated, and absolute. The neighborhood had survived yet another challenge, not through chaos or fear, but through the steady, disciplined hand of its king, a man whose reputation for strategic brilliance was now etched indelibly into the history of New York's most dangerous streets. By the summer of 1943, Harlem had settled into a tense equilibrium, but Bumpy Johnson knew that peace was never permanent in a neighborhood under constant threat from external forces. Dutch Schultz, frustrated by repeated failures, began exploring subtler methods of influence, testing the edges of Harlem's operations without directly engaging in confrontation. His agents moved through the streets like shadows, attempting to coax operators into cooperation through persuasion, intimidation, and indirect pressure. For Bumpy, this was a familiar pattern. The true danger was not always a gun in hand, but a whisper in the right ear, a subtle attempt to fracture loyalty from within. Maintaining the integrity of his network required vigilance, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior that few could match. Intelligence reports soon indicated that a key operator had been approached under Schultz's orders. The man, responsible for coordinating several high-stakes numbers operations, had been offered a significant payout in exchange for compliance. Such offers, while tempting to some, were carefully calculated tests designed to probe the boundaries of Bumpy's authority. The operator, though loyal, was wary. The temptation was real, and the stakes were high. Bumpy understood that the success of his strategy depended not only on intercepting external threats, but also on reinforcing internal cohesion. His response would have to be measured, precise, and both protective and instructive. That night, Bumpy arranged a private meeting with the operator in a quiet brownstone away from prying eyes. The conversation was calm, deliberate, and focused entirely on principle and consequence. "They will test your loyalty," Bumpy said, voice steady but commanding. "They will offer rewards, they will threaten. But you must understand, loyalty is not just about money or fear. It is about trust, foresight, and protecting what we've built. One wrong step, and the neighborhood suffers. Do you understand?" The operator nodded, recognizing the weight of Bumpy's words. This was more than a conversation. It was a lesson in discipline, a reminder that Harlem's survival depended on every individual understanding their role in a carefully structured system of protection and influence. Meanwhile, surveillance continued across the neighborhood. Bumpy's lieutenants shadowed Schultz's emissaries, tracking their movements and ensuring that any attempt to coerce operators would be noticed and neutralized before it could take effect. The strategy was quiet but unmistakable. Harlem would not bend, would not break, and would not be infiltrated. The operators, reassured by Bumpy's guidance, remained steadfast. The mafia's subtle manipulations were ineffective, and even those tempted by wealth or influence found themselves constrained by the invisible yet undeniable authority that governed every street and operation in the neighborhood. By dawn, the neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm. Streetcars rattled along Lenox Avenue, shopkeepers opened their doors, and Harlem's residents went about their routines, largely unaware of the silent battles being fought to protect their streets. Bumpy Johnson, however, remained vigilant, aware that this quiet period was temporary. Dutch Schultz's ambitions had been checked, his influence contained, and Harlem's operators were reminded of the value of loyalty and the cost of deviation. Once again, Bumpy had demonstrated that control was maintained not through overt violence, but through intelligence, strategic presence, and the careful orchestration of trust, a lesson that ensured Harlem streets would remain under his watchful eye, unbroken and resilient against even the most cunning adversaries. By late 1943, Dutch Schultz's frustration had begun to manifest in increasingly reckless maneuvers. After multiple failed attempts to influence Harlem's numbers game and operators, Schultz resorted to sending larger contingents of enforcers into the neighborhood, hoping sheer presence would intimidate Bumpy Johnson's allies. But Harlem was no ordinary battlefield. Bumpy's intelligence network had long since mapped the movements, loyalties, and patterns of every operator, street contact, and potential threat. The neighborhood functioned as an ecosystem, with each piece carefully monitored, and any disruption was immediately identified and addressed. Schultz, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, underestimated the depth and precision of Bumpy's reach. One evening, reports arrived of a particularly aggressive enforcer entering a Harlem nightclub known for its ties to key numbers operators. This man was notorious for using violence as a first resort, and his presence posed a direct threat to both the operators and the stability of Bumpy's network. Bumpy immediately deployed a dual strategy: observation and containment. Trusted lieutenants discreetly monitored the enforcers' movements inside and outside the club, while street-level operatives ensured that the neighborhood's rhythm continued uninterrupted. Bumpy himself remained nearby, blending into the crowd, his calm presence a counterweight to the potential chaos. Every detail was accounted for: exits, entrances, the timing of the enforcers' movements, and even the likely reactions of patrons who might inadvertently interfere. Inside the nightclub, tension hung thick in the air. The enforcer approached operators with thinly veiled threats and subtle intimidation. Yet at every turn, he encountered obstacles carefully orchestrated by Bumpy's network. Communications were intercepted, operators were discreetly redirected, and the man found himself increasingly isolated, frustrated, and unable to gain any traction. It was a masterclass in psychological strategy. The threat remained present, yet neutralized, a constant reminder that Harlem's loyalty and operations could not be subverted by intimidation or violence alone. The enforcer's every move had been anticipated, his options systematically reduced without a single public confrontation. Bumpy reinforced his control by emphasizing trust and awareness among his operators. Every attempt to weaken us is already accounted for, he explained in private meetings. Your loyalty isn't just about survival. It's about protecting what we've built and ensuring that Harlem remains ours. Any deviation, and the consequences are clear. These words, calm yet resolute, reminded his men that loyalty was active, not passive, and that observation and strategic intervention were tools as potent as any weapon. Harlem's operators, reassured by this guidance and the visible efficiency of Bumpy's network, remained steadfast, their confidence in his leadership reinforced. By morning, the enforcer had left the nightclub, his mission unsuccessful, and Schultz's attempt to infiltrate Harlem had been neutralized without a single shot fired. The neighborhood, seemingly calm, had experienced a silent but decisive victory. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated the principles that defined his reign: foresight, intelligence, and the meticulous orchestration of loyalty and influence. Harlem remained secure, its operators loyal, and its streets governed by a quiet but unyielding authority. Even Dutch Schultz, one of the era's most feared gangsters, had been reminded that in Harlem, power was measured not by force alone, but by the strategic brilliance of the man who understood the city's every pulse and shadow. By early 1944, Dutch Schultz had escalated his efforts in Harlem to an unprecedented level. After repeated failures to manipulate the numbers game and sway local operators, he became increasingly desperate. Schultz's enforcers were no longer subtle observers or low-level intimidators. Now, a highly trained, ruthless team was sent to directly confront Harlem's network. Their objective was clear: destabilize Bumpy Johnson's control, coerce key operators into compliance, and assert Schultz's dominance over the lucrative territory. For Bumpy, this was not simply a challenge to his authority. It was a test of strategy, foresight, and the very structure he had built to protect Harlem. Failure was not an option. The stability of the neighborhood depended on his calculated response. Intelligence reports arrived swiftly, detailing the enforcers' movements as they approached a critical Harlem tenement. Bumpy's network had already tracked their patterns, arrival times, possible routes, and potential points of contact with operators. Every variable was considered, every contingency planned. That night, Bumpy convened a small group of trusted lieutenants in a discreet brownstone. His voice was calm but deliberate. "They believe aggression will break us," he said, "but Harlem isn't won with force alone. Observation, strategy, and loyalty will outmatch every act of intimidation. Every operator, every block, every alley is part of the system. Let them move. We are already steps ahead." The room absorbed the weight of his words. This was more than leadership. It was a blueprint for survival in a neighborhood constantly tested by external threats. As the enforcers moved through Harlem, attempting to intimidate operators and disrupt the numbers game, Bumpy's network acted with precision. Operators were subtly guided away from danger, meetings were rerouted, and communications intercepted. Each enforcer found their path increasingly constrained, the network of observation tightening around them. Bumpy himself remained at a distance, his presence invisible yet commanding, monitoring the unfolding situation and ready to intervene if necessary. Every decision was calculated. Every movement had a purpose. Harlem was not a battlefield of chance. It was a carefully controlled ecosystem orchestrated to neutralize threats before they could escalate. The enforcers' frustration grew with every failed attempt. Schultz's plan, once promising, began to crumble under the weight of Harlem's invisible defenses. By subtly manipulating the environment and guiding operator behavior, Bumpy ensured that the enforcers could neither intimidate nor coerce anyone effectively. Every attempt at influence was countered silently, systematically, and without overt confrontation. Harlem streets remained calm, its operators loyal, and the mafia's presence exposed as impotent against the quiet, meticulous authority of its protector. The neighborhood had witnessed a lesson in strategy, power, and control without a single public altercation. By dawn, Schultz's enforcers had withdrawn. Their mission failed, leaving Harlem untouched. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, and loyalty were more powerful than violence alone. The neighborhood's operations continued uninterrupted, operators reinforced in their allegiance, and Harlem's streets secured under the steady, calculated oversight of a man whose foresight and strategy had repeatedly outmatched even the most dangerous adversaries. Dutch Schultz, despite his notoriety, had learned firsthand that in Harlem, the measure of power was not in the firepower brought to bear, but in the invisible hand that controlled the city's rhythm, loyalty, and survival. By mid-1944, Harlem had become a carefully balanced network of loyalty, observation, and controlled influence, but Bumpy Johnson understood that no system could remain untested forever. The neighborhood's stability, hard-won through years of strategic intervention, was now being probed by a new kind of threat, a highly skilled hitman, sent not merely to intimidate or coerce, but to directly challenge Bumpy's authority. This man, known for his efficiency and ruthlessness, arrived in Harlem with a reputation that preceded him, a walking instrument of fear, trained to dismantle networks like the one Bumpy had spent years building. The streets themselves seemed to hold their breath as the balance of power prepared to shift. Bumpy, ever perceptive, was aware of the hitman's presence before he could make his first move. Harlem's eyes and ears, a network of loyal informants and street-level observers, had reported the man's movements. The hotel where he checked in, the bars he frequented, even the unusual inquiries he made about operators in the numbers game. For most, this would have been alarming. For Bumpy, it was an opportunity. He understood that the key to neutralizing a threat of this magnitude was not a reaction born of panic, but a series of deliberate, strategic maneuvers designed to manipulate perception, isolate the adversary, and regain control without exposing the neighborhood to unnecessary risk. Over the following nights, the hitman attempted to establish his presence in Harlem, subtly probing for vulnerabilities. He approached operators under the guise of casual business, shadowed streets, and sought to gather intelligence that might give him an advantage. But every step he took was monitored. Bumpy orchestrated a series of interventions designed to misdirect, delay, and isolate. Operators were guided away from his reach, routine routes were altered, and surveillance contacts provided constant updates on his location. Harlem became a maze where the hitman could see only what Bumpy allowed him to see. Each action anticipated and countered before it could become a threat. Bumpy also used the opportunity to reinforce the loyalty and awareness of his inner circle. Private meetings were held in dimly lit rooms, away from the street, where operators and lieutenants were reminded of the importance of vigilance, discretion, and coordinated action. The streets watch, the eyes observe, and every man who moves against Harlem will find himself in a place of no advantage, Bumpy explained. His calm authority instilled confidence and a sense of shared purpose. The hitman's reputation, fearsome as it was, became irrelevant against a network operating with foresight, discipline, and unyielding loyalty. By the end of the week, the hitman had been neutralized as a threat without a single violent confrontation in public view. Harlem remained undisturbed, its operations intact, and its operators secure. The man, skilled in violence, had been outmaneuvered by intelligence, strategy, and the invisible authority of Bumpy Johnson. This episode underscored a key principle of his leadership. True power in Harlem was exercised not through reckless force, but through careful observation, anticipation, and the precise orchestration of loyalty and influence. The streets had been tested, and once again, Bumpy had ensured that the neighborhood's rhythm, autonomy, and safety remained firmly under his watchful, calculated hand. The presence of the hitman in Harlem had sent subtle ripples through the neighborhood, but Bumpy Johnson remained a calm, unshakable force. While most would have viewed a professional killer as an imminent threat, Bumpy treated it as a challenge to his intelligence and strategic control. His understanding of human behavior, combined with years of observation, allowed him to anticipate moves that others could not. Every step the hitman took, every inquiry made, every shadow he lingered in was catalogued and countered, turning potential danger into a demonstration of Harlem's impenetrable structure. Bumpy's calm authority became the invisible barrier no outsider could penetrate, a lesson in the subtle, unyielding power that defined his reign. The hitman attempted several approaches to locate Bumpy and his closest allies. Harlem, however, was no longer a neighborhood that tolerated unmonitored entry. Street-level contacts, shopkeepers, porters, and even casual pedestrians served as an intelligence network, reporting unusual behavior and movements that might indicate a threat. Bumpy's lieutenants coordinated responses in real time, subtly redirecting the hitman's path, creating false impressions, and isolating him from any potential targets. It was a game of anticipation and manipulation, where visibility equaled vulnerability, and every decision had consequences that could ripple through the streets if mishandled. Meanwhile, Bumpy reinforced the cohesion of his inner circle. Operators and lieutenants were reminded that loyalty was not passive. It required awareness, discipline, and proactive engagement. This man may have skill, but he does not understand Harlem, Bumpy explained during a discreet meeting. Every street, every operator, every routine has a purpose. We are not reacting, we are orchestrating. Observe, anticipate, and act only when the moment presents the advantage. Survival is in the details. His calm, deliberate tone left no room for hesitation, instilling confidence and discipline in his men. Harlem's stability depended on their adherence to these principles, and every individual understood the importance of their role. As the hitman moved through Harlem, attempting to gather information, Bumpy's strategy unfolded with meticulous precision. False leads, strategic placements of loyal men, and subtle interventions created a network of obstacles that limited the killer's effectiveness. Every approach he made was countered before it could escalate. The neighborhood, though seemingly calm, had become a living maze, a trap for those who sought to disrupt its order. The man's reputation for efficiency was rendered meaningless against a neighborhood orchestrated with foresight, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty. By remaining invisible yet omnipresent, Bumpy transformed the threat into an illustration of his strategic genius. By the end of this silent campaign, the hitman withdrew, frustrated and unable to achieve his objective. Harlem remained intact, its operators reassured, and its streets unbroken. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that dominance was not exercised through brute force alone, but through observation, strategic planning, and the careful orchestration of influence and loyalty. Even the most lethal adversaries could be neutralized without public confrontation when foresight and intelligence guided every move. Harlem had been tested, and Bumpy had ensured that the neighborhood's rhythm, security, and autonomy remained firmly under his watchful, calculated control, a testament to the enduring power of a man who understood the subtle art of unseen authority. The weeks following the hitman's failed attempt were a period of quiet consolidation for Bumpy Johnson. Harlem streets, while outwardly calm, had become a network of calculated observation and controlled influence, a system designed to neutralize threats before they could materialize. Bumpy understood that survival in Harlem required more than muscle. It demanded foresight, precision, and an unshakable understanding of human behavior. Each operator, each lieutenant, and each street-level contact was part of a larger mechanism that allowed him to maintain authority without the need for constant displays of violence. The neighborhood was both shield and chessboard, and Bumpy moved through it with the deliberate patience of a master strategist. The failed infiltration by Schultz's men and the professional hitman had a lasting impact on Harlem's criminal landscape. Operators who might have been tempted by external promises of wealth or influence were reminded that loyalty to Bumpy was the path to both survival and success. His authority was no longer simply respected. It was observed, tested, and reinforced through every successful intervention. Subtle communication, discreet surveillance, and coordinated action had created a fortress that existed not in walls or weapons, but in the minds and behaviors of those who understood the rules of the neighborhood. For Bumpy, this was proof that strategy, intelligence, and discipline were more effective than fear alone in maintaining control. During this period, Bumpy also took care to solidify relationships with local businesses and community figures. Club owners, grocers, and other influential residents were quietly reassured of the protection his network provided, while subtle reminders of loyalty were administered to any who wavered. The strategy was never about overt domination. It was about reinforcing a system of mutual respect, awareness, and careful observation. Harlem's social and economic fabric had become intertwined with Bumpy's methods, ensuring that the neighborhood's autonomy could withstand even the most determined external threats. As months passed, the neighborhood began to notice a rhythm of stability that had not existed before. Conflicts were preempted, loyalty was reinforced, and the streets operated under a subtle yet unyielding order. Bumpy's presence was felt in ways that were nearly invisible, yet unmistakably effective. Rival factions, observing the outcomes of their attempts to infiltrate Harlem, came to understand that the neighborhood operated on a system they could neither predict nor easily manipulate. Strategy, patience, and intelligence had repeatedly neutralized threats that might have overwhelmed a less disciplined leader. By the end of this period, Harlem had emerged stronger, more cohesive, and more resilient than ever. Bumpy Johnson had once again proven that true power in the neighborhood was exercised not through reckless aggression, but through foresight, loyalty, and meticulous orchestration of influence. The failed attempts by Schultz's men and the professional hitman had reinforced his reputation as a man whose authority was both invisible and absolute. Harlem remained intact, its operators secure, and its streets under the careful, watchful control of a leader whose brilliance in strategy and discipline had made him untouchable, a guardian whose influence was as enduring as it was invisible. Ensuring the survival and prosperity of the neighborhood, he ruled with calculated precision. By the fall of 1944, Harlem had become a neighborhood both resilient and alert, yet Bumpy Johnson knew that threats could emerge at any moment. The streets, though outwardly calm, carried subtle indicators of tension. Rival factions, frustrated by repeated failures to influence the numbers game and destabilize Harlem, began probing for weaknesses with renewed determination. Unlike past threats, this wave of disruption relied less on overt violence and more on subtle manipulation. Whispers of betrayal, false rumors, and carefully placed operatives intended to sow doubt and uncertainty among Harlem's operators. For Bumpy, this presented a complex challenge. one that required more than physical force. His response had to be strategic, psychological, and impeccably timed. Intelligence flowed swiftly through Bumpy's network. Trusted lieutenants and street-level informants reported unusual conversations in local bars, unexpected meetings at tenements, and minor discrepancies in operator behavior. Bumpy analyzed each report with meticulous care, identifying patterns that suggested a coordinated effort to destabilize his control. The adversaries sought to exploit human nature, testing loyalties and probing for vulnerabilities. Yet Bumpy had anticipated such tactics. He knew that the greatest threats often came from within, masked as opportunity, and his approach combined surveillance with subtle intervention to maintain the integrity of his network. That week, Bumpy initiated a series of interventions designed to reinforce loyalty and expose external manipulation. Private discussions with key operators reminded them that their allegiance was not just a matter of survival, but a safeguard for Harlem itself. They will try to divide us, to make small acts of disloyalty seem harmless, Bumpy explained calmly. Do not be tempted. Every choice, every word, every action matters. Observe. Report. Act only when the moment allows control. This neighborhood survives because we are disciplined, because we anticipate, and because we move as one. The operators absorbed his words with a mixture of respect and renewed determination, understanding that Harlem's survival depended on their vigilance as much as Bumpy's strategy. Meanwhile, Bumpy's lieutenants executed a precise surveillance plan. Those suspected of being approached by rival factions were monitored, not to intimidate, but to redirect their actions subtly and maintain stability. Operators were guided away from potential manipulation, routines were adjusted without notice, and communications were carefully managed to prevent the spread of misinformation. The adversaries, though skilled and persistent, found themselves frustrated by the invisible web of observation and discipline that governed Harlem. Each move they attempted was anticipated and countered before it could gain traction, leaving them isolated and ineffective. By the end of the week, Harlem remained intact, its operators loyal, and the neighborhood secure. The subtle campaign of manipulation had failed, neutralized not through confrontation, but through intelligence, discipline, and strategic oversight. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that the greatest power was exercised not with immediate force, but with foresight, calculation, and control over both perception and action. Harlem streets continued their rhythm, operating under a carefully orchestrated network of observation and loyalty. Rival factions understood the lesson clearly. In Harlem, influence could not be imposed through whispers or threats alone, for the neighborhood's protector moved with an intelligence and precision that made even the most skilled adversaries powerless. As 1944 drew to a close, Harlem had weathered threats from Schultz's men, professional hitmen, and subtle manipulations alike. Yet Bumpy Johnson knew that the neighborhood's stability was a fragile equilibrium, dependent on constant vigilance and precise orchestration. Every operator, every lieutenant, and every street-level informant formed part of a living network designed to anticipate and neutralize threats before they could escalate. The streets themselves had become a web of intelligence and influence, with Bumpy's presence both invisible and absolute. It was in this environment, where observation and foresight were weapons more potent than guns, that the next chapter of Harlem's defense began to unfold. One evening, reports arrived of an unfamiliar figure moving deliberately through the neighborhood, approaching key operators under the guise of casual conversation. This man, rumored to be a skilled hitman, was assessing opportunities to disrupt the numbers game while avoiding overt confrontation. For most, his arrival would have been alarming. For Bumpy, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the power of strategic intervention. Every movement was analyzed, every potential interaction anticipated, and the neighborhood's rhythm subtly adjusted to expose vulnerabilities while protecting its operators. Harlem became a maze where the hitman could see only what Bumpy allowed, each route calculated to maintain control and prevent escalation. Bumpy's approach combined intelligence, subtle intervention, and psychological strategy. Operators were discreetly redirected, meetings rescheduled, and patterns of behavior altered to limit exposure. His lieutenants monitored the intruder, relaying constant updates while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The hitman's reputation for efficiency was gradually neutralized by the neighborhood's invisible defenses. Every attempt to intimidate or gather intelligence was countered without open confrontation, demonstrating that control over perception and environment could be as decisive as the use of weapons. Harlem's streets, though outwardly calm, were a theater of disciplined observation, orchestrated entirely by Bumpy's foresight. Private consultations with operators reinforced loyalty and awareness. "This man believes fear can bend us," Bumpy explained in a low, steady voice. "But Harlem is not governed by fear. It is governed by knowledge, observation, and loyalty. Watch closely, anticipate, and remember that every small choice affects us all. The neighborhood survives because we act with intelligence, not impulse." His calm authority reassured his allies and reminded them that loyalty was active, requiring vigilance, discretion, and strategic engagement. Even those approached by the hitman understood the stakes and adjusted their behavior accordingly, maintaining the integrity of the network. By the week's end, the hitman had withdrawn, frustrated and unsuccessful. Harlem remained secure, its operators loyal, and its streets intact. Bumpy Johnson had once again proven that dominance was exercised not through overt violence, but through intelligence, discipline, and meticulous orchestration of influence and loyalty. The neighborhood had been tested, and the challenge had reinforced the invisible authority that governed every corner, alley, and operator in Harlem. Even the most skilled adversaries had learned that survival in this neighborhood depended not on fear, but on the calculated, watchful presence of a man who understood every pulse of the city and every nuance of human behavior. Harlem's rhythm continued, unbroken and resilient under his precise, strategic oversight. By early 1945, Harlem's streets had settled into a cautious rhythm, yet beneath the surface, Bumpy Johnson knew the neighborhood's stability was constantly under threat. Rival factions, frustrated by repeated failures to manipulate the numbers game and undermine his authority, began shifting tactics. Instead of overt aggression, they relied on betrayal from within, a subtle, insidious attempt to destabilize Bumpy's network by convincing operators to act against him. In a city where loyalty had always been currency, the idea that one of his trusted men might compromise the system struck at the heart of his strategy. This was no longer just a test of intelligence. It was a test of loyalty, and the consequences for failure would be both immediate and absolute. It began with whispers on the street, rumors of operators quietly approaching rival factions, of subtle meetings held in secrecy, of information being exchanged under the cover of casual conversation. Harlem's rhythm seemed undisturbed to the casual observer, but Bumpy's network of surveillance, informants, and lieutenants quickly identified irregularities. Every step, every whisper, and every unusual action was traced, documented, and assessed. He approached the situation with calm precision, understanding that the key to neutralizing internal threats lay in knowledge, observation, and a methodical approach that left no room for error. Bumpy called discreet meetings with his closest lieutenants and key operators. In a dimly lit room, the air heavy with tobacco smoke, he spoke with quiet authority. "Loyalty isn't just expected, it's observed," he explained. "One man who falters can unravel everything we've built. Watch closely. Report anything unusual. Understand that every choice matters, not just for yourself, but for the neighborhood. Harlem survives because we move as one." His calm demeanor carried weight, reinforcing the importance of vigilance while signaling that no betrayal, subtle or otherwise, would go unnoticed. Operators listened intently, their attention a reflection of the trust and fear intertwined in Bumpy's leadership. Simultaneously, Bumpy orchestrated a surveillance strategy that left the suspected betrayer exposed without alerting them to the scrutiny. Observers tracked meetings, noted inconsistencies in behavior, and coordinated with operators to subtly redirect actions. The betrayer, unaware of the net closing around them, continued their movements, believing their actions concealed. Bumpy relied on patience and timing rather than immediate confrontation. The goal was to ensure the individual's exposure was undeniable and instructive to the rest of Harlem's network. In this way, control was reasserted not through chaos, but through strategy and observation. By the end of the week, the betrayer was revealed and quietly confronted, their actions exposed to the appropriate parties. The resolution reinforced loyalty and illustrated the consequences of deviation, while Harlem's operations continued uninterrupted. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that authority in the neighborhood was maintained through intelligence, foresight, and the careful orchestration of influence rather than public violence. The streets remained secure, operators loyal, and the rhythm of Harlem unbroken. Even the most subtle attempts at betrayal were neutralized, reaffirming the principle that in Bumpy's Harlem, loyalty, observation, and strategy were the ultimate safeguards of power and survival. The discovery of the betrayer sent ripples throughout Harlem, a silent but unmistakable reminder that even the most subtle disloyalty would not go unnoticed under Bumpy Johnson's watch. Harlem's operators, lieutenants, and street-level informants now understood that loyalty was not a passive expectation. It was an active, daily practice requiring vigilance, discretion, and strategic awareness. Bumpy's approach to this internal threat was as meticulous as his handling of external enemies. Observe, isolate, and neutralize without unnecessary exposure or public spectacle. The neighborhood's security and cohesion depended on subtle interventions, psychological insight, and precise timing rather than visible displays of force. Once the betrayer had been identified, Bumpy implemented a series of measures to reinforce the integrity of his network. Operators whose allegiances had been shaken were discreetly reminded of the consequences of deviation and the rewards of loyalty. Meetings were held in private, away from the street, where his words carried both authority and instruction. We are stronger because we observe, because we anticipate, and because every man understands his role. One lapse can jeopardize all. Trust, vigilance, and discipline are our shields. His calm yet firm delivery left no ambiguity. Harlem's operators understood that loyalty was measured not in words, but in action, and every member of the network had to perform with consistency. Simultaneously, Bumpy's lieutenants reinforced surveillance and observation across the neighborhood. Streets were subtly monitored, communications tracked, and unusual behaviors immediately reported. Any attempt by rival factions to exploit the situation was intercepted, and their manipulations rendered ineffective before they could take root. Bumpy understood that internal threats could invite external ones, and maintaining Harlem's autonomy required constant coordination between loyalty, intelligence, and strategic oversight. The neighborhood became a living map of trust and observation, each street and operator a component in a meticulously maintained system designed to neutralize both internal and external challenges. The resolution of the betrayal reinforced not only Bumpy's authority, but also the psychological cohesion of Harlem's operators. The community learned that deviation from loyalty carried predictable consequences, while disciplined adherence ensured protection, stability, and prosperity. No public spectacle was necessary. The lesson was embedded in the network itself, operating quietly yet powerfully. The betrayer, now fully exposed and contained, served as a cautionary example of the consequences of misaligned ambition. Harlem's operators internalized this principle, understanding that their actions directly influenced the neighborhood's survival and their own security. By the end of this chapter, Harlem had emerged stronger and more cohesive than ever. The betrayer's exposure had reinforced loyalty, the operators' vigilance had been sharpened, and the neighborhood's stability remained intact. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated the effectiveness of observation, strategy, and subtle authority over brute force. Rival factions and potential internal defectors alike were reminded that Harlem's rhythm, security, and autonomy were under his careful, calculated control. Loyalty was not assumed, it was earned and observed, and those who sought to challenge it quickly learned that Bumpy's influence was invisible, absolute, and inescapable. Harlem thrived not because of fear, but because of a system of intelligence and discipline that ensured the survival of the neighborhood and its people. In the months that followed the betrayal, Bumpy Johnson turned his attention to consolidating Harlem's strength, ensuring that the neighborhood's operators, lieutenants, and community contacts fully understood the principles that had maintained stability through years of external and internal threats. The streets, though outwardly calm, were a living network of observation and influence, each movement measured, each conversation noted, and each potential vulnerability addressed before it could be exploited. For Bumpy, the challenge was never merely survival. It was the meticulous orchestration of loyalty, discipline, and foresight that allowed Harlem to operate autonomously, impervious to the manipulations of outside forces. The recent betrayal had left an indelible mark on the neighborhood. Operators were now acutely aware that their actions were observed and their choices carried consequences beyond personal gain or loss. Bumpy capitalized on this awareness, reinforcing the network with subtle interventions designed to strengthen both loyalty and cohesion. Trusted lieutenants were assigned to monitor the neighborhood's rhythm, subtly redirecting behaviors that might expose the system to risk. Communications were controlled, meetings carefully coordinated, and street-level operations guided with invisible precision. Harlem had become a theater of strategy, where every operator, every block, and every alley played a role in maintaining order. One evening, Bumpy convened a private gathering in a quiet brownstone, speaking to his inner circle with measured authority. "Harlem is not a neighborhood we merely protect," he said, voice calm but firm. "It is a system. Every man, every movement, every choice contributes to its stability. Betrayal weakens us, hesitation risks us. We survive not by reacting, but by anticipating. Observe, understand, act only when control is assured." His words resonated deeply, reinforcing the culture of discipline and vigilance that had become the foundation of Harlem's survival. Operators understood that loyalty was both their shield and their responsibility. Deviation could compromise the entire network, and every member had to act with precision. Meanwhile, rival factions, aware of Bumpy's recent consolidation efforts, attempted minor provocations to test Harlem's resilience. Small-time enforcers, minor bribes, and whispers of discontent were deployed, but each attempt was anticipated and neutralized before it could gain traction. Bumpy's network of observation, reinforced by the lessons of previous betrayals and external threats, allowed Harlem to absorb these incursions without disruption. Operators were subtly guided, street-level informants reported anomalies, and any external influence was contained before it could affect the neighborhood's rhythm. What outsiders perceived as calm streets masked a sophisticated, invisible system of control. By the end of this period, Harlem had emerged more disciplined and resilient than ever. The lessons of betrayal, observation, and strategic intervention had been internalized by every operator, lieutenant, and community contact. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated repeatedly that authority in Harlem was maintained not through fear alone, but through intelligence, foresight, and the careful orchestration of loyalty. Rival factions understood that subtle manipulation would not succeed, and internal threats had been exposed and neutralized. Harlem streets remained unbroken, its operators steadfast, and its system of influence precise and absolute. Through strategy, patience, and calculated control, Bumpy had ensured that the neighborhood would thrive, its rhythm and survival secured under his unyielding, invisible hand. As 1945 progressed, Harlem continued to operate under the invisible yet absolute authority of Bumpy Johnson. The neighborhood's operators had internalized the lessons from previous threats: external aggression, professional hitmen, and internal betrayal, and were now functioning with a heightened sense of discipline and awareness. Every street, every corner, and every interaction was part of a meticulously maintained system designed to protect the neighborhood's autonomy. For Bumpy, the work was never complete. Survival depended on constant vigilance, foresight, and the precise orchestration of both loyalty and influence. Harlem streets were calm in appearance, but beneath the surface flowed a network of observation, strategy, and control. During this time, a minor but persistent threat emerged: a series of subtle manipulations intended to create doubt among operators and test the loyalty of Bumpy's inner circle. Rival factions sent intermediaries with promises of wealth and power, hoping to exploit any hesitation. These were not overt attacks. They were psychological probes, small tremors designed to uncover cracks in Harlem's carefully constructed system. Bumpy recognized the danger immediately. He knew that the true threat often came not from the gun in a hand, but from the whisper in the right ear, the subtle suggestion that loyalty could be traded. Neutralizing such threats required strategy, timing, and the subtle reinforcement of trust throughout the neighborhood. Bumpy's response combined observation, redirection, and reinforcement. Trusted lieutenants discreetly monitored operators for signs of wavering loyalty, while street-level informants reported unusual behaviors or unexpected meetings. Operators who were approached by external parties were guided subtly, their actions redirected without confrontation, ensuring that potential breaches were neutralized before they could affect the neighborhood's operations. In private, Bumpy reminded his key allies of the stakes. Harlem's strength comes from knowledge, observation, and loyalty. Every small choice matters. One lapse can jeopardize everything we've built. Do not be tempted, do not hesitate, and remember that we move as one. His calm authority reinforced both discipline and confidence, ensuring that every member of his network understood the consequences of deviation. Over several weeks, the manipulative efforts of rival factions were rendered ineffective. Operators remained loyal, internal cohesion was reinforced, and Harlem's rhythm continued without disruption. The subtle threats, intended to weaken the neighborhood's structure, had failed entirely. Bumpy's network had turned potential chaos into a demonstration of its own efficiency, showing that intelligence, strategy, and subtle authority were more powerful than any overt act of intimidation. Harlem was not just surviving, it was thriving under a system of control that extended beyond what outsiders could perceive or influence. By the end of this period, the neighborhood's strength and discipline were undeniable. Bumpy Johnson had once again shown that leadership in Harlem relied not on displays of force, but on foresight, observation, and the meticulous orchestration of loyalty and influence. Even minor threats were neutralized before they could gain traction, demonstrating that the neighborhood's operators were loyal, the streets secure, and Harlem's system of governance precise and unbreakable. The lessons of observation, patience, and strategic intervention had been internalized, ensuring that the neighborhood's survival and autonomy remained firmly under Bumpy's watchful, calculated control, a testament to his enduring skill and unshakable authority. By the spring of 1945, Harlem had become a fortress of loyalty, observation, and disciplined coordination. Yet Bumpy Johnson remained acutely aware that no neighborhood, no matter how well defended, could escape continuous threats. The city beyond Harlem's borders was in flux, with rival factions still seeking opportunities to exploit any weakness. Bumpy understood that even minor lapses could have cascading consequences. His strategy was never reactionary. It relied on foresight, intelligence, and the quiet orchestration of both trust and control. Every operator, lieutenant, and street-level contact was part of a living system designed to anticipate challenges and neutralize threats before they could escalate. A new test emerged when a local operator, influenced by external pressure, began acting subtly against Harlem's established network. The man was not overtly disloyal, but his behavior suggested a willingness to cooperate with outside interests. For most, such actions might have gone unnoticed, but Bumpy's intelligence network had already identified the deviations. He immediately implemented a multi-layered response, blending surveillance, psychological strategy, and subtle redirection. Trusted lieutenants monitored the operator, while street-level contacts were positioned to report any unusual activity. Communications were carefully managed to ensure that no misinformation spread, and the neighborhood's rhythm remained undisturbed. Bumpy personally engaged the operator in a private, controlled meeting. The setting was dim and intimate, a room removed from the street's noise and scrutiny. "You understand what loyalty means here," Bumpy said, his voice calm but resolute. "Harlem's strength is in its people, its systems, and its discipline. One misstep can unravel what we've built. You must choose carefully, not just for yourself, but for the neighborhood. Observe, report, act with purpose. This is not just survival, this is responsibility." His words were precise, measured, and unmistakable in their authority. The operator, confronted with the reality of Bumpy's oversight and the clarity of the consequences, realigned his actions to preserve both his own position and the integrity of the network. Simultaneously, Bumpy's lieutenants reinforced the neighborhood's defensive structure. Patterns of behavior were adjusted, operators were subtly guided away from external influence, and the system of observation ensured that no threat, subtle or overt, could penetrate Harlem's defenses. Even those who had been tempted by outside promises of wealth or power were reminded through silent, coordinated interventions that deviation was both observed and strategically countered. Harlem streets, calm on the surface, were a living web of intelligence and influence, capable of neutralizing threats before they could disrupt operations. By the conclusion of this challenge, Harlem had emerged stronger and more cohesive than ever. The operator had been redirected, loyalty reinforced, and the neighborhood's rhythm maintained without public confrontation or chaos. Bumpy Johnson had once again demonstrated that true authority in Harlem was exercised not through immediate force, but through foresight, intelligence, and the meticulous orchestration of influence. Rival factions learned anew that manipulation, intimidation, or subtle infiltration would not succeed. Harlem's streets remained secure, operators loyal, and the neighborhood's autonomy intact, a testament to the enduring strategy, patience, and unshakable control of the man who ruled its rhythm with invisible, absolute authority. By mid-1945, Harlem had endured years of tests, external threats, professional assassins, rival factions, and the constant risk of betrayal from within. Yet through every challenge, Bumpy Johnson had maintained the neighborhood's integrity, not through brute force alone, but through a system of intelligence, foresight, and disciplined control. Each operator, lieutenant, and street-level informant functioned as a vital part of a living network, where observation, coordination, and loyalty ensured that Harlem remained unbroken. The streets, though outwardly calm, had become a theater of strategy, where every action, word, and movement was accounted for within the invisible framework Bumpy had meticulously constructed. This final chapter of ongoing challenges, a subtle but dangerous threat emerged. A coalition of minor operators and external intermediaries attempting to coerce and manipulate key figures in Harlem's numbers game. Their approach was carefully calculated, designed to exploit hesitation or the slightest lapse in loyalty. But Bumpy, having experienced years of similar tests, immediately recognized the patterns. His strategy combined observation, subtle intervention, and psychological reinforcement. Every unusual meeting, every whispered rumor, and every shift in operator behavior was noted, mapped, and countered before it could escalate. Harlem's rhythm continued uninterrupted, its defenses operating silently but effectively. Bumpy's leadership was on full display during this campaign. He engaged privately with operators suspected of being targeted by the coalition, reinforcing loyalty, awareness, and the stakes of deviation. Harlem is ours because we observe, because we anticipate, and because we move as one, he said, voice calm but authoritative. Those who are tempted by outside influence must understand that loyalty is not passive. One misstep threatens not just yourself, but every man and woman who relies on this system. Observe, act deliberately, protect the neighborhood. His words carried weight, reaffirming the operators, understanding that the strength of Harlem depended as much on discipline and foresight as on physical protection. Simultaneously, Bumpy orchestrated a coordinated neutralization of the coalition's influence. Operators were subtly redirected, communications monitored, and movements anticipated, leaving the external intermediaries frustrated and powerless. No overt violence was necessary. The neighborhood's structure itself acted as a barrier. Every attempt to infiltrate, manipulate, or coerce was rendered ineffective through the meticulous coordination of Harlem's loyal network. The streets, shops, and operators continued their daily routines, unaware of the invisible orchestration that ensured the neighborhood's stability and autonomy. By the end of this campaign, Harlem had emerged once again unbroken. The coalition's efforts had failed entirely, loyalty was reinforced, and the rhythm of the neighborhood remained under Bumpy Johnson's precise and calculated control. This final test underscored the principles that had defined his leadership: strategy over brute force, observation over assumption, and loyalty over fear. Rival factions and internal threats alike had learned that Harlem was a system governed by foresight, intelligence, and unyielding discipline. In the face of every challenge, Bumpy had demonstrated that true authority was invisible, absolute, and enduring, securing the neighborhood's survival, cohesion, and prosperity under the watchful, strategic hand of a man whose influence could never be shaken. 5 stories. 5 tests of loyalty, strategy, and survival. From the streets shadowed by Dutch Schultz's ambition to the subtle manipulations of would-be betrayers, Bumpy Johnson had guided Harlem through a landscape fraught with danger and deception. Each challenge was met not with reckless force, but with careful observation, calculated intervention, and the quiet orchestration of influence that left rivals frustrated and operators secure. The neighborhood had been probed, infiltrated, and tested in ways most leaders could never anticipate. But Bumpy navigated each threat with foresight, patience, and an understanding of human behavior few could match. Harlem's rhythm, though outwardly calm, was a living testament to his leadership. Operators, lieutenants, and street-level informants had internalized the lessons of discipline and loyalty, ensuring that every decision, every movement, and every interaction contributed to the neighborhood's survival. Bumpy's authority was not born of intimidation alone. It was reinforced through respect, trust, and the certainty that deviation carried consequences. External threats, professional hitmen, rival mafia factions, and subtle manipulators were neutralized quietly yet decisively, demonstrating that true power was exercised not in the chaos of open confrontation, but in the precision of strategy and observation. Each story had revealed a different facet of Harlem's survival under Bumpy's guidance: the betrayal of insiders, the probing by enemies, and the attempts at infiltration all tested the integrity of his network. Yet in every instance, his methods turned potential catastrophe into demonstration, a lesson in foresight, influence, and the subtle art of control. Harlem was more than a neighborhood. It was a system, a living network that operated under the unseen yet absolute authority of a man whose intelligence and strategic brilliance had made him untouchable. As the dust settled after each test, Harlem's operators and residents gained more than security. They gained understanding. They witnessed the efficacy of loyalty, the importance of foresight, and the quiet but undeniable authority of Bumpy Johnson. His reign was not defined by the loud declarations of power, but by the invisible, disciplined control of every aspect of the neighborhood. Each threat overcome reinforced the network. Each challenge neutralized strength and cohesion, and each lesson left a legacy of strategic mastery and enduring influence. In reflecting on these 5 stories, one truth becomes clear. Bumpy Johnson did not merely survive the chaos of Harlem, he shaped it. He transformed threats into lessons, betrayals into reinforcements of loyalty, and challenges into demonstrations of intelligence and strategy. Harlem was his chessboard, every operator a piece, and every street a calculated move. His influence endured because it was rooted not in fear alone, but in foresight, discipline, and the unwavering orchestration of a network that ensured the neighborhood's security, cohesion, and resilience. Through strategy and patience, Bumpy Johnson became more than a man. He became the invisible force that defined Harlem's survival and legacy. If these stories of Harlem's untouchable king left you in awe, now is the time to act. Hit that like button and show that you recognize the brilliance of strategy, loyalty, and foresight that Bumpy Johnson wielded over the streets. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week we uncover untold tales of power, influence, and survival that history almost forgot, diving deep into the minds of men who shaped neighborhoods, nations, and criminal empires alike. Comment below. Which moment of Bumpy's brilliance stunned you the most? The foiled assassination attempts, the betrayals exposed, or his quiet orchestration of Harlem's rhythm? We're building a community that doesn't just watch history, it experiences it. Every video takes you inside the strategy, the decisions, and the calculated risks that turned ordinary streets into a landscape of disciplined influence and intelligence. Don't miss the next installment, where we reveal how Bumpy faced one of his most dangerous adversaries yet, navigating a deadly game of manipulation and force without ever breaking the rhythm of Harlem. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Every like, every comment, every subscriber ensures that the lessons of foresight, loyalty, and strategy continue to reach viewers who appreciate the subtle, calculated power that defined figures like Bumpy Johnson. The streets of Harlem may have changed, but the lessons from its king remain timeless. Join us, stay connected, and witness how the untouchable managed the chaos, turned threats into lessons, and orchestrated a legacy that endures far beyond the streets he protected.